Okay, stop. Okay, hi everybody. We are starting all over again. I apologize for those who had joined us at the regular time. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at Beth Avraham Yosef. I had to leave my office at the shul and go to my home because for whatever reason there's no internet in the shul today. So it just stopped all of a sudden. There's also some technical problems, I understand, with the platform at webyeshiva.org, which is the platform that we're using today. So there may be some difficulty in displaying the handout that I wanted to share with you today. The handout is downloadable, however, from Facebook. There's a Facebook community called Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and it is accessible to everyone to download for free from Facebook. What I am going to try to do, and we'll see if this works, if it doesn't work, is to share my screen with you. It seems to be working now that everyone can see my screen. What I had started to talk about, and I just want to start all over again, is that the Rambam in his introduction to the guide, his very introduction to Moreh Nevukhim, had said that there are going to be places where it's going to appear to you, my reader, that I am contradicting myself. And you may think that that is because I may have forgotten what I had previously written or I'm just being sloppy. He says, I want to assure you that that is not the case. I know exactly what I am doing, but there are certain times that I will seemingly contradict myself. And the reason why I do so is because there are certain very subtle or complex ideas that need to be presented in this way. And only the truly learned and wise individual will be able to peel away the surface apparent contradiction and arrive at the truth. The reason why I raise this issue now, specifically that we're studying chapter 40 of the second section of the guide, is because the Rambam had just gotten through telling us in chapter 39 that there is no other prophet other than Moshe Rabbeinu, other than Moses, who was the lawgiver, who was the giver of the laws that God wished for man to fulfill. Anyone who came before Moses may have achieved prophecy, but did not do so as giving God's law. And anyone who comes after Moses is not able to give God's law because there's only one law. And that's the reason why Moses' prophecy was unique, different from any other person's prophecy. And there was no one before Moses, there will come no one after Moses to be a giver of God's law. Now, it seems that the Rambam forgets about that in the very next chapter, in chapter 40, where he talks about his political philosophy. As I had started to mention, the Rambam is living in a milieu in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages where Plato's Republic is held up as the paragon of a system of government, where you have someone who is the monarch, the philosopher king, as Plato calls him, who is imbued with prophetic insight and is able to have a perfected intellect and is able to rule his country with wisdom and benevolence. Democracy in the Islamic world at this time, and certainly this was the opinion of the great philosopher Muhammad al-Farabi that the Rambam looked up to as being a great transmitter of wisdom, really very much believed that democracy was a failed system of government because you're relying on the lowest common denominator of the citizenry to make decisions for the entire state. And that's not the best way to run a state. Even in the modern world, Winston Churchill has said all forms of government are terrible. Democracy is the least of the most terrible, right? In other words, I'm paraphrasing, but we all recognize the shortcomings of democracy, but it seems to be the least dangerous in a world where there have been dictatorships that have risen that have wrought havoc upon civilization. But the Rambam is aware of this. He wrote a work in his youth called his Treatise on Logic. There are some modern scholars who question the authorship of this text, but most scholars and most Meforshim accept that the Rambam wrote it. It's really a book on describing terms that he uses in logical argumentation. But at the very end of this treatise on logic, the end of the Sha'ar Yud Daled, the end of the 14th gate, the Rambam talks about governments of a city. And I have it for you here in the handout. He writes, as for the governments of the city, it is a science that provides its inhabitants with knowledge of true happiness and the way of striving to attain it, and with training their moral qualities to abandon things that are presumed to be happiness. In other words, the perfect system of government is not just meant to make sure that everyone behaves themselves and abides by the rules of society, but also provides people with wisdom, knowledge, so that they can attain personal happiness. It likewise prescribes for them rules of justice by means of which their associations are well ordered. The learned men of bygone nations used to posit governances and rules in accordance with the perfection of each individual among them, by means of which their kings govern subjects. They called them nomoi, which is the term that many translators use, but in Hebrew it's called nimusim. This work was originally written in Arabic, but all of the Hebrew translators seem to call it nimusim. These are basically rules of conduct, rules of etiquette that a country imposes upon its citizenry to abide by. The nations were governed by these nomoi. The philosophers have many books concerning all these things that have been translated into Arabic. What has not been translated may even be more extensive. But, and this is the key sentence, this very last sentence, but in these times, all of this has been dispensed with. I mean, the regimes and the nomoi, for people are governed by the divine commands. In other words, now that we have a Torah, in the ancient world, there was no Torah before the Torah was given, and therefore kings had to use their best guesses using their own wisdom to institute rules of conduct for their state. But now that we have a Torah, there is only one set of rules that man must abide by, and those are the rules of the Torah. Keep that in mind. The Rambam opens up this chapter with the following statement: man is political by nature, and it is his nature to live within society. Where did the Rambam get this from? He got this from Aristotle's Politics, Book 1, Part 2, where Aristotle says it is evident that the state is a creation of nature and that man is by nature a political animal. Now, what does he mean by nature? By nature means that it's a natural phenomenon because man is a social animal, that man will structure himself within societies. It is not by some kind of unnatural force that human beings coalesce into communities and into societies. It's a natural part. Man has an instinct, a social instinct to coalesce within communities. He who by nature and not by mere accident is without a state is either a bad man or above humanity. You're either below humanity or above humanity if you don't feel comfortable living within a society. Now that man is more of a political animal than bees or any other gregarious animals is evident. Nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal whom she has endowed with the gift of speech. And he goes on and on from here. I'm not going to read the entire section from Aristotle, it's readily available online. But knowing that the Rambam is basing himself on Aristotelian philosophy that he has received via, most likely, Muhammad al-Farabi, who really wrote an entire book on the perfect state, um, I want to go through the entire chapter using the following outline. So, number one, and the wording in this chapter is particularly difficult to sort of untangle, and I'm not sure whether the Rambam did that intentionally or not, to try and obscure some of the perhaps more esoteric things he was trying to communicate, but we're going to try our best to untangle all of the language for you. So the first point that the Rambam makes is that man needs society. We establish two facts about man. First, man instinctively is a social creature, as Aristotle had already pointed out. But second, we establish that the individual constituents of the human species are more diverse than any other species of being. Now, this is a fascinating point that the Rambam makes, is that when you look at all other species of living creatures, you will discover that they are more homogeneous. There is less variety within other species of creatures. Man is the most variegated creature that exists in this world. Now, why is this? This is due to man being created last, and presumably, we're just inferring from what the Rambam's point is, the later the creation, the more complex. Thus, man is the most complex of all creations, and his complexity allows for greater diversity. Therefore, no two humans have the same attitude with respect to moral character. And as a matter of fact, the Rambam is echoing something that our sages say in Tractate Brachot, page 58a. She'ein da'atam domeh ze lazeh, ve'ein partsufeim domim ze lazeh. That just like no two people look alike, you can tell a person's identity by looking at their face, because everyone's face is unique. So too, human beings thinking, every human being's thoughts are unique, and people are extremely diverse in the way that they approach ideas and they approach the world around them. Man is also composed of a higher level of form. To bring the point forward even further, the reason why mankind is so variegated is because man is imbued with a very healthy dose of form, more than other creatures who are mostly matter and very little form. And just as different objects of matter have different accidents, have different attributes that make them different from each other, so do different forms. The more imbued with form a being is, the more there is a subjectivity to being variegated, to having a variety of different forms. You may thus find a man so cruel that he kills his youngest child, while another man cannot bring himself to kill an insect. That is the example that the Rambam gives as an illustration of how diverse people are in the way that they think, in the way that they approach life. The Rambam also points out, just as Aristotle does, that man is a creature of speech, and in order for human beings to be able to realize their potential of communication, they need to live with each other. That's one of the reasons why man is a social animal. So, having established that man needs society and that man is the most diverse creature, we then go to the idea of how we structure those societies. Man's society cannot be perfected without a ruler, and this is a direct quote from the Rambam, who gauges the actions of individuals, perfecting that which is deficient and reducing that which is excessive, and who prescribes actions and moral habits that all of them must always practice in the same way. In other words, what the ruler is going to the proper ruler is going to do is going to be taking into account how much variety there exists within his societies, within his state, and trying to take those extreme personalities and set up rules where those extreme personalities will not disrupt the social order. He says by doing this, two things are, and he'll prescribe actions and moral habits that everyone has to conform to. By doing this, two things are accomplished. Number one, the natural diversity that exists within individuals is hidden by conventional behavior. And number two, the community becomes well ordered. You have a sense of knowing what to expect. Traffic will flow in one direction and laws will be obeyed. Litter will not be spilled out onto the street because everyone, no matter how diverse and variegated their personalities are, order will be maintained within the society. Point number three, I therefore maintain that our Torah, even though it is not natural, enters into what is natural. Now go back to the language of Aristotle and you'll understand what the Rambam means by natural. Remember that man is by nature a political animal, and he who by nature and not by mere accident is without a state is either a bad man or above humanity. He says, nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain, and man is the only animal whom she has endowed with the gift of speech. So, what is natural for man? Because it is natural for man to have a social order, because he needs to live within a society, we would normally, therefore, expect nature to prescribe a set of rules for that state, for that social order. The Torah is not created by that social order. The Torah was created by God and was imposed upon man. And that's what the Rambam means when he says that the Torah is not a natural phenomenon. It is not something that coalesced naturally when a society of people came together and appointed a ruler over themselves, and that ruler came up with a social order through an organic process that is part of man's instinctive nature. But even though the Torah was a supernatural phenomenon and was introduced from an external source, from God Himself, it enters into what is natural, i.e., even though it was not created by men, it accomplishes the function mentioned above, which would naturally have evolved within civilization had God not given us a Torah. In other words, and here Rav Kafach tries to suggest that what the Rambam is explaining is no one should ever argue that because the Torah is an artificially introduced construct into the social order of human beings, it is too cumbersome, it is too imposing upon a social order to comply with. That is not true. When God gave us the Torah, He gave us the Torah as our creator, understanding the human makeup and understanding what human beings are capable of and understanding what human beings require in order to have a properly ordered state. And that is the reason why Hashem gave us the Torah. It is because it is the perfect social construct for a society to live and realize their ultimate humanity and reach their ultimate happiness. So, therefore, he says it enters into what is natural. And as an adjunct to that, God gave man an instinct for ruling so that our species may be maintained, which is why even had there been no Torah, man would have set up a system of rulership without a Torah. But now that we have a Torah, as the Rambam had written in his treatise on logic, then all other systems of law that are set up by other rulers are rendered obsolete because we have the perfect system. Now the Rambam, despite saying that, then goes into a discussion of different systems of government. There are different kinds of men who set up law. The first type is either the prophet or the lawgiver. Now, we refer you back to chapter 37. The Rambam had taught us that there are certain people who believe themselves to be great visionaries and even prophets, but they are not. It's because they have a very vivid imagination faculty and they have visions of grandeur and of what they feel is the will of God. But in reality, they are conjuring images in their own minds and deluding themselves into thinking that they are prophets. But both types of people may have the certain personality makeup to rise to leadership positions. It'll either be a prophet who is a leader, a ruler over a country or over a state, or it'll be someone who deems himself to be a prophet and to have visions and therefore creates laws. The second, so that's in the first category, people who create laws and deem to rule over a nation. But then we have a second type of people who present law to a state, is lower than both of the first type, in that he has the ability to enforce the laws made by the first type, but lacks the intellect to create those laws himself. He pretends to have created the law himself or to have received the prophecy, when in reality he is plagiarizing. He is taking a legal system that was created either by a prophet or by someone who thought that he was a prophet, but who was a visionary. He takes those laws and then attributes them to himself. Such a person of this latter type may choose to adopt only a portion of the law that he has heard from the true ruler, either because it is either easier for him to do so, or because taking only a subset of those laws will impress upon others that he is the originator of this unique set of laws and is not a plagiarizer, okay, a plagiarist. And he writes, that just to quote the Rambam, for among the people there are men who admire a certain perfection, take pleasure in it, have a passion for it, and wish that people should imagine that his perfection belongs to them, though they know that they possess no perfection. And what the Rambam is essentially saying is that when you have a person who is of great uh, there are people in this world who are of great talent to be natural leaders. They can either be prophets or near prophets. They have vision. They know what the law should be. There are other people who are lower than them who do not have that same level of genius and vision and ability to understand and grasp a situation. But they admire those people who are the natural leaders. and they will therefore try to emulate them and plagiarize their knowledge for themselves. He says people similarly plagiarize others' poetry and scientific discoveries. For an envious and lazy individual sometimes comes upon a thing invented by somebody else and claims that it was he who invented it. So the Rambam is spending a tremendous amount of time in this chapter talking about people who themselves are not worthy for true rulership, but who plagiarize and insert themselves in positions of leadership and pretend to be the visionary leader, pretend to be the philosopher king, when in reality they are not. Now, why is the Rambam devoting so much space to this? Well, it could be, right, because he's going to be getting to really in a very subtle way, trying to allude to the fact that there are other systems of government that exist even in his own time, where the ruler has deemed himself to be either a prophet or a visionary, but in reality he is neither, because he has only plagiarized other people's wisdom and imposed that upon the state. Now, this kind of plagiarism exists even among those claiming prophecy in one of two ways, he says. The first kind is one who claims to prophesy but never had such a prophecy. An example of this is in the case of a man named Tzidkiah ben Kena'anah, who lived in the times of King Achav and King Yehoshaphat of Judea. And this was a man who claimed to have a prophecy that if King Achav and King Yehoshaphat went and allied their armies together, they would be able to defeat the Aramean army. And he even not only represented himself as being a legitimate prophet, but he constructed for himself horns of iron to sort of actualize his alleged prophecy, and said, with these horns, you will be able to defeat the Arameans. And the truth is, he was misled. He had a vision, he had a very vivid imagination faculty, like the Rambam had mentioned in chapter 37, thought he was a prophet, but was really not. And so therefore he was not plagiarizing, he just deluded himself into thinking he was a prophet. But then there's another kind of fraud, and that is the one who plagiarizes someone else's legitimate prophecy. And this is the case with a man whose name was Hananiah ben Azur. Hananiah ben Azur lives in the times of Jeremiah the prophet, in the times of King Nevukhadnezzar, who's about to destroy the temple. And he brings a prophecy that is really a plagiarism of Jeremiah's prophecy. He says, Ko amar Hashem tzivakot Elokei Yisrael lemor, shavarti et ol melech Bavel. I will break the yoke of the king of Bavel, of the king of Babylon. And the Talmud actually makes reference to to this fact that there are different kinds of false prophets. There are three different kinds of false prophets. The Rambam is just addressing the first two in this discussion. The Talmud in Sanhedrin, page 89a, says, Shlosha mitatan bidei adam. There are three people who, if they are false prophets, will be executed in a Sanhedrin. The first one is Hamitnabe Mashalo Shama, if a person prophesizes when he really never had a prophecy. And the second kind is Uma Shalo Ne'emar Lo, if he presents a prophecy as his own when it was really given to somebody else. And the Gemara gives as an example of these two, the first two, the first one is Tzidkiah ben Kena'anah, the person who lives in the times of Achav and Yehoshaphat, who really never had a prophecy and deluded himself into thinking that he was a prophet. And the second kind is the person who hears someone else's prophecy and uses it as his own. This was Hananiah ben Azur. And the Talmud explains that he had heard the prophet Jeremiah talking about the people of Elam who were under the rulership of the Babylonians. And his argument was that if God will break the yoke of Elam, he will also break the yoke of Bavel. And that was his extrapolation from Jeremiah's prophecy. But he himself never received the prophecy, but he knew that the prophecy was true based on what he had heard from Jeremiah. And now the Rambam points out, he says, look, point number 5. My reason for delineating all of the different kinds of lawgivers is so that you should know how to differentiate between the different kinds of rulers. Firstly, when a ruler clearly delineates that his rules are not based on prophecy, but rather on their own thoughts, rather on the ruler's own thoughts, no further clarification is necessary. I'm not here to try and tell you not to follow the ruler of your state. But the ruler of your state has to be honest. If he is going to say plain out, I'm not a prophet, I did not receive these laws from God or from any other higher source, I've made up these rules because I think that they make sense, then there's nothing wrong with following that ruler if you deem him to be a wise person and his rules and his laws are beneficial for the state, then obviously you can follow those rules. However, there are those who claim that their rules are based on prophecy, and these may be divided into three categories. A, the truly prophetic, which, as you know from the last chapter, chapter 39, is only true by Moses. Number two, the merely man made laws, and their lawgivers are deluded into thinking that they are prophecies. And number three, the plagiarized prophecies. And you'll see why this is important momentarily. Point number six, if you encounter a legal system which is purely utilitarian for the operation of the state, that is, the laws are directed exclusively toward the ordering of the city, and attention is not at all directed toward speculative or intellectual matters to help the members, the individual members of the state, develop their intellects and to become true knowers of truth. If the laws are not directed for that purpose, then no heed is given to the perfecting of the rational faculty within man to help a human being achieve true happiness and true perfection of their humanity. If there are no laws that are put into place to help people think correctly and to have proper attitudes towards reality and the world around them, then this is an indication that the law is man-made. It's purely utilitarian for the sake of preserving order within society. And the lawgiver belongs to the third category from chapter 37, that the lawgiver has a rich imagination faculty, may be a visionary, but is not a prophet. Point number seven, but if you find a legal system whose ordinances pay attention to both the maintenance of the physical needs of the state and also to correct opinions with regard to God, then you must know that this guidance comes from him, may he be exalted, and this law is divine. Now, just to read that inside on page 384, I just want to read you the language of the Rambam because it's quite salient and it's concise. He says, if on the other hand, you find a law all of whose ordinances are due to attention being paid, as was stated above, to the soundness of the circumstances pertaining to the body, and also to the soundness of belief, a law that takes pains to inculcate correct opinions with regard to God, may he be exalted in the first place, and with regard to the angels, and that desires to make man wise, to give him understanding, and to awaken his attention, so that he should know the whole of that which exists in its true form, you must know that this guidance comes from him, and may he be exalted, and that this law is divine. Now, remember, the Rambam in chapter 39, just one chapter ago, had said that there is only one person who fits this bill, and that is Moses. So why go through this whole process of trying to discern who's real and who's not real? We already know the answer to who's real and who's not real. There is no one other than Moses who is the true giver of divine law. What is the Rambam doing this for? Be patient, please. We're almost towards the end. Point number 8. The only thing left for clarification, and this is the last page of the chapter, is the giver of that law. Is he a legitimate prophet or is he a plagiarist? Is he taking somebody else's law, repackaging it, and presenting it as his own? The litmus test is to consider, quote, the perfection of the individual, to carefully examine his actions, and to study his way of life. The most important indicator is the man's approach to bodily pleasures and especially sexuality. If a person is ascetic in the way that he lives his life, he abstains from indulgences of the bodily kind, then you know that there is a greater likelihood that this person is receiving laws from a divine source. And that would certainly explain from the Rambam's perspective why Moshe in particular had to be celibate, because he had to demonstrate to the world that he was a legitimate lawgiver. Um, Now, we'll get to the fact that this is potentially a polemic against other religious leaders. We're going to get to that in just a minute. And as the Rambam writes, there were two alleged prophets in Jewish history. One's name was Tzidkiah and the other name was Achav, who were exposed because of their sinful sexual behavior as false prophets. Now, this is not the Tzidkiah and the Achav that you may be familiar with in Tanakh. These are minor figures who are mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 21 to 23. Their names are Achav ben Kolaya and Tzidkiyahu ben Ma'aseyah. And to the best of my knowledge, they are not mentioned anywhere else. But Jeremiah castigates them that I will place them in the hand of Nebuchadrezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar. Why? Because Yan Asher Asu Nivala Yisrael, because they committed something vile within Israel. Vayena'afu et neshei re'ehem, and they committed adultery with the wives of their friends. That is the reason, and they spoke in my name falsely. They are false prophets. And the litmus test that they were false prophets is that they were given to bodily indulgence, especially sexual issues, which demonstrates that they could not be proper receptacles to be givers of divine law. Now, the Talmud in Sanhedrin, page 93a, has an extensive discussion as to who these two people were and describes the whole story. It actually relates to a Haftarah, which we recently read over Hanukkah, about Yehoshua Kohen Gadol, Joshua the high priest, one of the first high priests of the Second Temple period, is described as having bigadim tsoim, as having dirty clothing, in a vision that the prophet Zechariah has. And the Talmud explains that they were summoned by King Nebuchadnezzar because they claimed to be prophets of God, but they also propositioned Nebuchadnezzar's daughter for sexual favors. And as a result, there was some suspicion that these people were not legitimate. So King Nebuchadnezzar took these two people and said, I'm going to throw you in a furnace like I did with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were truly legitimate prophets, righteous men, and see if a miracle is performed for you as it was for them. They said, well, there's only two of us. You got to give us a third person because maybe you need three people to have merit save us and have a miracle performed for us. So they said, give us Yehoshua Kohen Gadol, thinking that he would protect them. The fact is, they all three were thrown in the furnace, just like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they were incinerated in the furnace, and Yehoshua Kohen Gadol was spared miraculously, but nonetheless his clothing became singed, and the Talmud relates why his clothing became singed, but that is the vision that Zechariah has of Joshua the high priest with dirty clothes, i.e. singed clothes. Now, that's how the Rambam ends his chapter. He says you need to have a proper litmus test to have clarity on who is a prophetic ruler, who is that philosopher king, who is that great leader who is bringing divine law to his people. It is possible that such a being exists. However, you will and you may encounter a system of law which is wonderful. It provides to the people everything that they're looking for, both by way of the utilitarian ordering of the state, but also providing people with a sense of purpose and being and a perfection of their intellects to make them into perfect human beings. It sounds like he's legitimate. It sounds like he's representing the word of God. Not so fast. Maybe he's a plagiarist. How do you know? Look at his personal character, look at his behavior. Now, why is the Rambam doing this? We've already established that Moses is the only lawgiver. So here, my friends, we're not going to be able to expand on this issue for any extent of time. But my final comments are, this seems to be a polemic against both Islam and Christianity. We know that Muslims, which is the world, the milieu where the Rambam is living, certainly made the claim that their prophet Muhammad was this kind of philosopher king that is being described both in Plato's Republic, in Muhammad al-Farabi's book, The Perfect State, and therefore the Rambam says he seems to fit the bill of this person who is providing a system of law in the Quran that is perfect. It provides the proper ordering of the state. It provides personal fulfillment for the individual to develop their intellect, to have proper ideas about God, and so forth and so on. But you have to examine the giver of the law. Did he live an exemplary life of asceticism and abstinence? And if he did not, if he instead lived a life of bodily indulgence, then you must question the legitimacy of that prophet's authority. And it's clear that the Rambam is making reference to the originator of Islam. According to Rav Kafach and some other commentaries, he may be making reference to Christianity as well, in the sense that we know that there is a story in the Talmud that describes Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachia, who, according to legend, is the mentor, the Rebbe of Yeshu HaNotzri, Jesus the Nazarene. And the Talmud describes in an account in Tractate Sota, the Talmud tells us that a teacher should always push away with the left hand and bring close with the right hand, meaning that even when you need to be critical of a student, you need to do so in such a way where the student needs to be castigated, but at the same time given the opportunity to come back. And one of the examples is, which was censored out of some editions of the Talmud and was only inserted later, is the story of Yeshu HaNotzri, where he was once traveling with Rabbi Yoshua ben Prachia. They came to an inn. The innkeeper was a woman. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, after exchanging a discussion with her, where they arranged a place to stay in her inn, commented to his disciple, "This was such a wonderful person that we just dealt with. How kind and how wonderful this person is." And Yeshu HaNotzri's response was, "Yes, but she has squinty eyes." He was critical of her physical appearance. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia castigated Yeshu HaNotzri, completely put him in cherem, excommunicated him. He says, "What kind of disciple do I have who looks upon a woman's physical appearance? Your whole objective is therefore for your own pleasures of the eye and perhaps other things, and therefore you are no longer my student." And the Talmud is critical of Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, that because of his rejection of Yeshu HaNotzri, he went off and started his own sect of religion. Okay, I think I've said enough here. I don't want to elaborate on either the Rambam's polemic against Islam or Christianity in this chapter, but the only way that I can make sense of why the Rambam feels that this chapter is necessary is for polemical reasons, to clarify that after I've already told you that there is only one lawgiver, it's Moses, who gave the Torah to the Jewish people, anyone who claims that they have a different set of law that was given and fits the bill of having a prophetic ring to it, you can easily disprove it by pointing out that it's either a plagiarism or a false prophecy, and the way to determine that is to look at the nature of the giver himself. Okay, I hope that was helpful. I again apologize for the technical difficulties that we had today, and I hope to see you next time where we will continue this discussion. Are there any questions before we go offline? Anyone? I know that there was someone who may have had a question, but if not, you're always welcome to reach me by email, or you can reach me by Facebook or by WhatsApp. Take care, everybody.
Wait, just one quick question.
Yes, yes, please.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
So I wanted to ask also the nature of the prophecy, what he's predicting. Is it good or is it bad? Because if it's a bad prophecy and it doesn't come true, I feel like he still might be an authentic prophet because depending on what they prophesize, if someone prophesizes good and it doesn't come true, then we know that that prophet is a false prophet. But if somebody
Correct.
prophesizes something bad and it doesn't come true, it still doesn't disqualify him. So I'd also like
Correct.
to, think about the nature of the prophecy and what he's actually
Yeah.
predicting. So I guess
You're, you're,
it
you're,
takes
you're
time.
actually, you're 100% correct. This is what the Torah discusses in Sefer Devarim and Parshat Re'eh. The Torah talks about how you can determine whether a prophet is legitimate or not. But I'll tell you something. The Rambam, I believe, is less concerned about weeding out false prophets than he is in trying to polemicize against rulers who claim to be prophets. And even when, and that's really his point, is that even when a ruler brings a system of law that seems to be fitting the bill of something that came from a divine source, you still have to look at the lawgiver himself in order to determine its veracity. Okay?
Right.
All
Yes.
right. Thank you, everybody. Take care now. We'll see you next time.
Yes, you too.